My husband's last words were in a letter I hid behind our wedding photo. No one knew it existed. But last night, a man walked into my house and went straight to that frame. He didn't search. He didn't ask. He just reached for it. How did he know where to look? So tell me, what do you do when the man who holds you at night might be the reason you're a widow? Grace Whitman lost her husband on a cold October night. The police called it a tragic accident, a fall from a hiking trail. No witnesses, no suspects, just a grieving widow, and a case that quietly closed. But then, 3 months later, someone new moved in next door. Thomas Cole. Quiet, thoughtful, kind. The kind of man who brings you soup when you're too sad to eat. The kind who listens when no one else will. And slowly, Grace began to feel something she thought she'd never feel again. Alive. But there was something strange. Thomas knew things, small things, like how her husband took his coffee, where they honeymooned, the nickname only Evan used for her. And one night, when Grace finally asked him, "How do you know so much about my life?" he smiled and said nothing. So the questions began to haunt her. Who really was Thomas Cole? What secret was her husband hiding before he died? And why did the investigator who closed her husband's case move in right across the street from the widow he once interviewed? Some neighbors bring casseroles. Others bring the truth you're not ready for. Grace Whitman wasn't always the woman who sat alone by the window. Once, she was vibrant. A freelance writer with a sharp mind and a love for storytelling. She married Evan Whitman 7 years ago, a charismatic real estate broker with a smile that could sell you a dream. And for a while, they lived one. Beach trips to the Outer Banks, weekend renovations on their little craftsman home, anniversary posts that made people believe in love again. From the outside, they were perfect. But perfection has a way of cracking when you look too close. The neighbors remember things, raised voices through open windows on summer nights, credit card bills piling up on the kitchen counter, and strange men, well-dressed, unfamiliar, showing up at the house late at night when Grace wasn't home. She told herself it was work, real estate deals, client meetings, but deep down, she knew Evan was keeping something from her. She just didn't know what, and she never got the chance to ask. 3 months after the funeral, a moving truck pulled up next door. His name was Thomas Cole, 38, soft-spoken, kept to himself. He told the neighbors he worked remotely, something with data analysis, vague, forgettable, the kind of man who blends in. Grace noticed him one morning when her mailbox door wouldn't close. He came over without being asked, fixed it with a screwdriver and a quiet smile. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said. She hadn't told him, but he explained before she could ask. It was all over the local news, and she believed him, because why wouldn't she? Grief is a lonely country, and Grace had been living there for months, so when Thomas checked in on her, she didn't push him away. She started baking again, something she hadn't done since Evan died. She'd leave a plate of cookies on his porch. He'd return the favor with coffee the next morning. They'd sit on her front steps and talk about nothing. Books, weather, the stray cat that wandered the block. Never about Evan, never about the past. And slowly, something began to grow between them, a glance that lasted too long, a hand that brushed hers when he passed her a mug, a laugh she thought she'd forgotten how to make. It felt wrong. It felt necessary. It felt inevitable. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where something felt off. The way he knew she liked her tea with honey, not sugar. The way he asked about her writing, even though she'd never mentioned it. The way he looked at her sometimes. Not like a neighbor. Not like a friend. Like someone who'd been watching. Like someone who already knew her story. Because in grief, The mind searches for familiarity, for comfort. But sometimes, comfort comes from the same place as the pain. And Grace was about to discover that the man who made her feel alive again was the one person who knew exactly how her husband died. Let's go back to the night Grace's life shattered. October 14th, a Tuesday. Grace had been at a coffee shop downtown, working on a freelance article that was already 2 days overdue. She came home just after 9. The porch light was off. That was the first strange thing. Evan always left it on for her. She found him in the garage, slumped in the driver's seat of his Mercedes, engine still running, the air thick and poisoned. She screamed for help. Called 911, but it was already too late. Evan Whitman was gone. The police arrived within minutes. They took photos, asked questions, searched the scene, and within 48 hours, they closed the case. The verdict? Suicide. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Self-inflicted. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. Just a man who, according to the report, had been under financial strain and emotional distress. Open and shut. A tragedy, but not a mystery. But Grace couldn't accept it, because Evan wasn't suicidal. He was stressed, yes, distant maybe. But he had plans. A trip booked for their anniversary, a new client meeting scheduled for that Friday. He'd even left her a note on the counter that morning. Don't forget, dinner at 7. I love you. Does that sound like a man ready to die? And then, there were the inconsistencies. Small things the police didn't seem to care about. No fingerprints on the ignition key. Not even Evan's. A voicemail deleted from his phone just hours before his death. Grace never heard it, and the phone company couldn't recover it. And the note. Every suicide has a note, they say. But Evan left nothing. Not a word. Not an explanation. Just silence. Grace tried to move on. She tried to believe what they told her. But grief has a way of keeping you sharp. And one afternoon, 3 months later, something happened that changed everything. Thomas had borrowed her car to pick up groceries. His was in the shop. When he returned it, Grace found something wedged under the passenger seat. A folder. Old, worn, unmarked. She opened it, and her blood went cold. Inside were photos of her. Dozens of them. Taken from a distance, time-stamped, walking to her mailbox, sitting on her porch, leaving the grocery store. All of them, after Evan's death. And at the top of the file, written in clean block letters, Whitman, Evan, case no, 2447. Grace's hands shook as she flipped through the pages. Police reports, autopsy notes, scene photos she was never allowed to see. And then, a business card. Faded, creased. Thomas Cole, private investigator, her neighbor, the man who fixed her mailbox, who brought her coffee and made her laugh again. He wasn't just a neighbor. He'd been investigating her husband's death, and he'd been watching her. That night, Grace waited for him on her porch. When Thomas came home, she was holding the folder. He stopped, saw it, and for the first time, his calm exterior cracked. She stood, walked toward him, and asked the only question that mattered. "Why do you have these?" He didn't run. He didn't lie. He just looked at her, eyes dark, unreadable, and said the words that would haunt her forever. "Because I was there that night." Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table, the folder spread out before her like evidence at a crime scene, photos, reports, timestamps, and one question burning through her mind. Who is Thomas Cole? So she did what any writer would do. She started digging. She pulled up old news footage from the week Evan died. Local coverage, brief, forgettable. Real estate broker found dead in apparent suicide. Then she found the police report, public record, buried in the county database. Lead investigator on the case, Detective Thomas Cole, her neighbor, the man who'd been bringing her coffee, the man who'd held her hand when she cried. He wasn't just around when Evan died. He was the one who closed the case. But that wasn't all. Grace kept digging. Court records, internal affairs logs, personnel files she probably shouldn't have been able to access. And that's when she found it. A complaint, filed 6 months after Evan's death by another detective, Laura Benton. The document was short, clinical, damning. It claimed that Detective Thomas Cole had withheld evidence during the investigation, that he'd declared the case a suicide prematurely, that he'd refused to follow up on witness testimony suggesting Evan had been threatened in the weeks before his death. The complaint was dismissed, lack of proof, but Laura Benton resigned 2 weeks later, and Thomas Cole, he left the force entirely, moved away, and 3 months later, moved in next door to Grace. Grace's mind raced. What had Evan been involved in? She started pulling threads, his business records, bank statements, email accounts she'd been too afraid to open before, and slowly, a picture began to form. Evan had been drowning in debt. Over $200,000, money owed to people with no last names, no addresses, just initials, burner phone numbers. There were emails, vague, coded, about deals going south and pressure from above. One message, sent 2 days before his death, said simply, "I can't keep lying for you. I'm done." Grace didn't know who he'd sent it to. The account had been deleted. She confronted Thomas again. This time she wasn't asking. She was demanding. "What did you find? What did Evan do?" Thomas sat across from her, calm as ever. And he said something that made her blood run cold. "Your husband wasn't who you thought he was, Grace, and I didn't hide evidence to hurt you. I hid it to protect you." But Grace wasn't buying it anymore. "Protect me from what?" He hesitated. Then, quietly, "From the people he owed money to, from the things he was involved in, and from the truth that he didn't kill himself." Grace felt the room tilt. "What are you saying?" Thomas leaned forward. "I'm saying someone wanted your husband dead, and when I started asking questions, I was told to stop, so I buried the case. I left the force, and I moved here to make sure you were safe." "Safe from who?" He didn't answer. He just looked at her, and for the first time, Grace wondered if she'd been asking the wrong questions all along. That night, Grace went back through everything. The photos, the timeline, the security footage from neighbors' doorbell cameras, and then she saw it. A photo from 2 years ago. A neighborhood barbecue. Summer. Laughter. Evan grilling burgers. Grace is in the frame, smiling, holding a glass of wine. But in the corner, blurred, barely noticeable, is a man. Tall, dark jacket, watching from the edge of the yard. Grace zoomed in. Her stomach dropped. It was Thomas. He'd been around far longer than she thought. Long before Evan died. Long before he became her neighbor. He'd been watching. And suddenly, a new question consumed her. What if the person comforting you is the same person who controlled the truth? Grace was no longer sure who to trust, but she knew one thing. She was going to find out what really happened to her husband, even if it meant confronting the man who claimed he was protecting her, even if it meant discovering that she'd been living next door to the truth all along. Grace gave him one more chance to tell the truth. They sat in her living room, the fire crackling, the rain hammering the windows, and she placed the photo on the table between them, the one from the barbecue, him in the background, watching. "How long have you been lying to me?" Thomas stared at the photo for a long time, and then he broke. "I met you before Evan died," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I was assigned to investigate him, financial fraud, suspicious activity. I showed up at your door one afternoon to ask questions." Grace remembered. A detective. Polite. Professional. She'd offered him coffee. They'd talked for 20 minutes. She hadn't thought about it again. but Thomas had. "You smiled at me," he said. "You asked if I wanted sugar in my coffee, and I couldn't stop thinking about you." He told her everything, how he'd watched her from a distance during the investigation, how he'd seen the way Evan dismissed her, ignored her, came home late without explanation, how he'd found things, evidence, that would destroy the image of the man she thought she'd married. Evan had another woman, a second mortgage Grace didn't know about, and debts tied to people who didn't forgive mistakes. Thomas hesitated to include it in the report, because he knew what it would do to her. And then, Evan died. Thomas stood over the scene that night. He saw the evidence, the fingerprints that didn't match, the voicemail that had been deleted, the signs that pointed to something more than suicide. And he made a choice. He buried it, altered the report, declared it suicide. Not because he was corrupt, but because he wanted to protect her from the truth, from the shame, from the danger that came with digging deeper. "I didn't want you to know what kind of man he really was," Thomas said. "I thought, if I closed the case, you could move on. You could grieve the version of him you loved." Grace sat frozen. Everything she thought she knew was unraveling. "So you lied to me," she whispered. "You destroyed evidence. You let whoever killed him walk free because you wanted to protect me?" Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "I fell in love with you the moment you opened that door, Grace. And yes, I made the wrong choice. But I couldn't let you suffer more than you already had." She shook her head. "That wasn't your decision to make." "I know," he said. "I know." Love made him lie. And that lie became the foundation of everything between them. The comfort, the connection, the intimacy, all of it, built on a cover-up. He'd rewritten her husband's death to spare her pain, but in doing so, he'd stolen her right to the truth. And now, sitting across from him in the firelight, Grace had to decide, was he the man who saved her? Or the man who betrayed her? Because sometimes, the person who protects you from the truth is the one who keeps you trapped in the lie. Grace couldn't sleep after that night. Thomas's confession played on a loop in her mind. "I fell in love with you the moment you opened that door." But something still didn't sit right. If he truly loved her, why hadn't he told her the truth from the beginning? Why move in next door and pretend to be someone he wasn't? She needed answers, real ones. So she went back to the only place she hadn't fully searched: Evan's things. She'd packed most of his belongings months ago, clothes donated, papers shredded, jewelry stored away. But there was one thing she'd kept: his watch, a silver Seiko he wore every day. She'd never been able to bring herself to sell it. That night, she held it up to the light and noticed something she'd missed before: a tiny seam along the back of the casing. She pried it open, and inside was a micro SD card. Her hands trembled as she slid it into her laptop. One file, audio recording, dated 3 weeks before Evan's death. She pressed play and heard her husband's voice. Evan, recorded. "Grace, if you're hearing this, something's happened to me. And I need you to know, don't trust the man next door. His name is Thomas Cole. He's been following me, watching us. I confronted him last week, and he told me to stay quiet about what I found. But I can't. I won't. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident." Grace sat frozen. Her breath caught in her throat. Evan knew Thomas. He'd confronted him weeks before his death. And Thomas never said a word. Grace grabbed her keys and drove straight to the police station. She demanded to see the original case file. The detectives hesitated, searched the system, and then looked at her with confusion. "Ma'am, there's no file under that case number anymore." It had been deleted, erased from the database entirely, and when she asked about Thomas Cole, former detective, lead investigator, they found nothing, No employment records, no forwarding address, no trace that he'd ever worked there at all. Grace raced back home. She pulled into her driveway and looked across the street. Thomas's house was dark, blinds drawn, no car in the driveway. She ran to the front door and knocked. No answer. She peered through the window. Empty. Furniture gone. Like no one had ever lived there at all. He was gone, vanished, as if he'd never existed. Grace stood on his empty porch, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She thought the truth would set her free, but instead, it left her haunted by the man who took her pain and became it. Months passed. Grace tried to move on. She sold the house, started over in a new city, therapy, writing, rebuilding. But some ghosts don't stay buried. One afternoon, she opened her mailbox and found a letter. No return address, no postmark, just her name, written in careful block letters. She opened it. Inside, a single sentence. "You were never supposed to know, but I'll always be watching out for you." Unsigned. Grace's hands shook as she lowered the letter. She looked up. Across the street from her new apartment, a house she'd never paid attention to before. The porch light flickered on, slow, deliberate, and in the window, a shadow, tall, still, watching. Grace took a step back and whispered to herself, "He's still here." Because some people don't just fall in love. They obsess, they follow, they protect, whether you want them to or not. And Grace Whitman would spend the rest of her life wondering, was he her guardian angel? Or the man who destroyed everything she ever loved? So now I ask you, would you forgive someone who lied to protect you? Someone who buried the truth, not out of malice but out of love? Or would you rather live with the pain of knowing, no matter how much it destroys you? Think about it. Grace had a choice. Live in the safety of Thomas's carefully crafted fiction, or face the brutal reality of what her husband had become and who had taken him from her. What would you do? I want to know. Comment your answer below. Would you choose the comfort of a lie, or the devastation of the truth? And if this story left you on edge, if you're still thinking about Michael's shadow in that window, then you're going to want to hear what happened in The Photographer's Lie. A woman, a missing husband, and thousands of photos that should never have been taken. Trust me, you won't see it coming. Subscribe now for more real-life stories of love, mystery, and obsession. The kind that blur